Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the St. Pius X Church and our exciting speaker series, Let's Talk About It. My name is Amelia Rodriguez, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Our Let's Talk About It topic is Peace and War in the Catholic Tradition. We are very, very fortunate to have Father Thomas Massaro, S.J., with us here to review the history and tradition of Catholic reflection on armed conflict, including the principles of the just war theory, while highlighting the Church's enduring call to peace. Our format this afternoon will be a brief introduction of Father Tom, who will share his expertise and thoughts on this topic. After Father Tom's talk, we will conduct a question and answer session, and we invite you to write your questions on the index cards provided in the pews. Just raise your hand and our able volunteers will come by and collect those cards. One housekeeping item, please silence your phones for the talk. And before I formally introduce Father Tom, I would like to take a few moments to thank the folks who make this special event possible. First of all, Father Sebastian, who senses that his congregation would benefit from learning about complicated issues from a Catholic perspective. Thanks, Father Sebastian, for this intellectual and spiritual nourishment. There's also Althea Fusco, Lois Montorio, Luisa Pampa, and Marina Cardillo Pratt, four dynamos who energize the aims of this Let's Talk About It series. Ladies, we so appreciate your efforts. And finally, Dennis Jacobs, an active parishioner of St. Pius X and provost at Fordham University, who suggested and facilitated bringing Father Tom to St. Pius today. Thanks very much, Dennis. And now just a little bit about our very distinguished speaker. Thomas Massaro, S.J., is professor of moral theology at Fordham University. A Jesuit priest of the East Province, he served as professor of moral theology at Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Boston College, and at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University, where he also served as dean. 6 years after his arrival at Fordham, he was awarded the McKinley Chair of Religion and Society in 2024. Father Tom holds a doctorate in Christian social ethics from Emory University. He has published 11 books and over 100 articles devoted to Catholic social teaching and its recommendations for public policies oriented to social justice, peace, workers' rights, and poverty alleviation. A former columnist for America magazine, Father Tom writes and lectures frequently on such topics as the ethics of globalization, peacemaking, environmental concerns, the role of conscience in religious participation in public life, and developing a spirituality of justice. Two of his most recent books analyze the social teachings and moral leadership of Pope Francis. Father Tom's goal with us today is to review the conditions of the just war theory and to emphasize the abiding concern of Pope Leo and all previous Catholic leaders with establishing lasting peace, regardless of the specific circumstances of global affairs at any given moment. He has taught courses at Fordham on this topic for nearly a decade. Please Please join me in giving Father Tom a hearty St. Pius X welcome.
Let's see. Oh, it's working. It's fantastic. This is the best sound system I've had at any parish. And by the way, I was cutting it pretty close. I had an 11 o'clock Mass at Fordham University Church. It's great. It was on the radio. It's always on WFUV radio. Tune in Sunday at 11. And then the students I thought I had plenty of time to get here for 1 o'clock. Students organized a May crowning of our statue of Mary, which was great. No one told me about it, but I had a role in it. I led a decade of the Rosary and everything. So I was like, it's getting pretty close to 12:30. Am I going to get to St. Pius X? But I did. I've never been here before. I've never been in Scarsdale, as far as I know. I did grow up. Can you tell from my wicked Queens accent? I grew up in Queens over the Long Island side. You don't need to know that. And here I am at Fordham University for about a decade now. And I do. Thank you, Amelia. You said some nice things. It is true. I have, over time, in the writings that I've done, gathered a certain amount of expertise in the just war theory. That's the topic for today. So I will try to share that with you in a very direct way. The pages that you have, we'll go about halfway through, we're going to turn to that chart. I put that chart together about 15 years ago when I wrote, I could show you the books, one of the books here. And it's been helpful to my students, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you. The most important word that Amelia said in that very generous introduction started with the letter C. Did you notice the word towards the end, conscience? The just war theory it appeals to the conscience of every one of us as Catholic lay people, as priests as well, Father Sebastian and myself. Recently, Pope Leo and many of our cardinals, I'll mention the names of a few U.S. cardinals, have weighed in on this war with Iran just since, I think it started February 28th. So roughly 2 months has been an opportunity for dialogue about how people can shape their conscience regarding the question, can we justify this war? Does it go against the teachings of the church? Does it go against the scripture? Does it go against your conscience? So if I'm not here to persuade anybody of new things, but hopefully to bring the tradition, it's over almost 2,000-year-old tradition of Christians reflecting on war and peace. That's the title of this talk. And so hopefully you'll leave not with opinions that match mine, opinions that make sense for you as you understand a little better after this 30 minutes or so, the tradition of the just war theory, okay? And I think the way to get to that is to talk about the beginnings of the church, okay? So, Jesus, we're still in Easter. Jesus rises from the dead, the first Easter. He ascends. We're going to have Ascension Thursday in 10 days. He ascends into heaven. The Holy Spirit comes upon the church on the first Pentecost, so we're 2 weeks away from that. Celebrate that in the year 2026. And then it was like, oh, now we have to figure out a lot of things. Jesus isn't here anymore. So the early church said, well, what were the things that Jesus said about many topics? But at a certain point, they got around, the apostles and the early Christians. What did Jesus say about peace? Well, then they started remembering a lot of things he said about peace, and we say many of them in the liturgy. Peace I give to you, not as the world gives peace do I give to you. Peace be with you. Those are the first words that Pope Leo said at his first appearance after being elected almost exactly a year ago, May 8th, 2025. So the church had a high regard for peace. And I'll summarize by saying, for the first 3 centuries of the history of the Christian church, Christians were pacifists, okay? So I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes about pacifism, 1 minute about crusades or holy war, and then the rest of the talk about the just war theory. And that's when your charts will come in, okay? So 3 options: pacifism, holy war, and just war theory. What is pacifism? when the early Christians tried to decide how they would relate to the Roman Empire, remember they lived in the time of the Roman Empire, how they would make judgments about if I get drafted into the Roman army, will I serve? That was a really big question for the first 300 years of church history. And guess what their conclusion was? Peace. Absolute pacifism. We usually call it creedal nonviolence. A nonviolent perspective takes extremely seriously, I'll say literally, the words of Jesus, not to lift a hand against another. If you strike you on your left cheek, turn your other cheek as well. Do not do harm even to those who hate you. Even in the Beatitudes, Jesus said, be peacemakers, don't raise a hand in anger against anybody. Now, I've been teaching this course to the Fordham students for almost a decade. Always one of them, usually one of the smartest people, raises his or her hand and says, but what about that time when Jesus showed anger and he turned over the table of the money changers in the temple? He showed righteous anger. And I always say, good for you. You know your scripture. As a matter of fact, all 4 Gospels have that account. 3 of them are really brief. The one in John chapter 2, it happens very early in John's Gospel, even includes one further detail. You may remember this, that he made a whip of cords and he brandished it. It doesn't say that he struck anybody, by the way, okay? But he was so eager. Remember the phrase, zeal for my Father's house consumes me? It's actually in the Psalms. So Jesus never struck anybody as far as we know. He did it that one time. So one time out of 28 chapters of John's Gospel, he brandished a whip of cords. So put that on hold. The lesson that the early Christians took is that to be a Christian is to say an absolute blanket no to wars, armaments, fighting, even in the family, right? You're supposed to be nonviolent and creedal pacifists. So for 3 centuries, Christians actually were persecuted for not joining the Roman army, for resisting Caesar, for not bowing down in worship before Caesar. And did anything ever change? Those of you who know your early history, in the year 312, the Emperor Constantine, who was not baptized a Christian until his deathbed, by the way, but he saw a sign in the sky, the cross, and it said, in hoc signo vincias, IHS is the phrase. And he thought, and he won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. He attributed his victory to the God of the Christians, the cross. He saw the sign in the heavens. He wasn't a Christian, but he was persuaded to favor the Christians. And from that point on, he treated the church, well, we called it the Edict of Toleration, the year 313, and gradually, Christian thinkers, there were some historians like Eusebius, the popes in the 4th century, started cozying up to the emperor, okay? And eventually, this made it seem pretty okay for a Christian to join the Roman army, even to bear arms. They weren't wildly enthusiastic, but once we had a Roman Empire that stopped persecuting Christians, the Christians said, okay, maybe I can support the Roman Empire. And those popes in the 4th and 5th centuries gave permission for Christians to raise the sword, to be a soldier in the Roman army. Many still clung to pacifism, but we have reports, reliable historical reports, of Christians after Constantine, that moment in 312, joining the Roman army, okay? Now, why is that significant? Some people thought that was the most horrific thing. They called that the Constantinian turn. Oh, Christians should have stayed with pacifism. Christians should have continued to follow the literal words of Jesus, not to strike your enemy even after they've struck you. Other people saw that as the most realistic thing to do. And most people at that time, the church stopped being persecuted, started to assimilate into society, started to accommodate the Roman system. It was still a pagan system, but Christians were tolerated. And then by the end of the 4th century, under Constantine's grandson Constantius, 387 or so, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so you probably have a picture of the Middle Ages, the 400s, the 1000s, where Christians were the dominant group throughout Europe, and eventually practically a monopoly of Europe were Christians, okay? So by then, pacifism, creedal nonviolence, absolute no, refusal to partake in war, to pick up arms, that had gone by the wayside. And by the way, there was always a small number of people who stuck with pacifism. In the Protestant Reformation, the time of Martin Luther, the 1520s, a small group, we call it the radical left wing of the Reformation, they became pacifists again. It was a return. And we have groups like the Amish, the Quakers, the Mennonites, and there are some other Church of the Brethren. So there's still a group of Protestant churches, small, typically small ones, not the Episcopalians, not the Methodists, not the Baptists, who subscribe to absolute pacifism. We call them the peace churches. And they are a witness. They're not very numerous, but they are a witness. They will not raise a hand in anger against anybody. So in the Catholic Church, I'm now at the very end of my pacifism section. In the Catholic Church today, there has been a revival of pacifism after what, 1,000 years, almost 2,000 year, 1,700 year gap. Dorothy Day and Peter Morin started the Catholic Worker, not far from here in New York City, Lower East Side. I was just down there yesterday. They started a lay movement, a holiness movement, serving the poor, houses of hospitality, still going today. There's Catholic worker houses all around the country. The original one's still down there at the Bowery area. And they have creedal pacifism as part of their founding document. It's called the Aims and Means of the Catholic Worker. There are other pacifists in the Roman Catholic Church. They're not the only ones. There's the Pax Christi, and there's various peace movements, various brotherhoods. I can't remember the names of all of them. So it's still a minority voice. But pacifists were very encouraged in the 1960s, Second Vatican Council. One of the major documents, one of the last documents, was called Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World. Paragraphs 78 and 79, it's a long document, talks about the value of pacifism. Even though it's a small minority of Catholic voices, it counts for a lot. It's a reminder of the values that Jesus taught, the purity of the gospel, having a refusal to pick up arms. Okay, so that's school one. There's 3 schools. That's the first school. It's the simplest one. It's a blanket no to taking up arms. And we know about conscientious objection, CO for short, people who are Catholics who go before the draft board. When we had a draft conscription, it was last in the Vietnam War era, 72 or so, it ended. And they would state the case. I believe in pacifism. I believe in the literal words of Jesus not to strike your enemy, and therefore I beg the court to relieve me of the duty of serving in the army through the conscription or the draft. So that was respected. There weren't many, but there were some Catholics. And by the way, there were a lot of Mennonites, there were a lot of Amish, there were a lot of Quakers who made the case to these draft boards, and they got out of military service. Maybe they had some alternative service. Okay, so that's a little sketch of pacifism. Creedal nonviolence. The second school. This is the worst one, by the way, and I'm only going to give it 1 minute. The Crusades, okay? Sometimes it's called the Holy War tradition. So starting around the year 1095, so the end of the 11th century, this is a long time ago, the Christian, what do they call, the Holy Land, Jerusalem, areas around where modern-day Palestine and Israel are, the pilgrimage places, like where Jesus walked. Christians in Europe, England and France and Italy and Spain, Portugal, they wanted to go there and pay a pilgrimage, but they were blocked by the fairly new religion of Islam. It had been founded in the 7th century, and the Islamic, as the caliphates, the sultans, controlled that land, and they stopped Christians from going there. So a couple of popes, Urban II was the most famous, they said, we have to stop this. So they rallied all of the troops, they were really the knights, people with arms in France and Europe, and they said, let's put together a flotilla of ships. You've heard about the Crusades. Let's go over there under the banner of the cross. That's the word crusade means cross in those Romance languages, Latin, crux. So thousands of people went on a series there. I think there were at least 8 crusades. Somebody counted as many as 15. I think some of them were really small. Expeditions from Western Europe through Constantinople. And by the way, they sacked Constantinople, an Eastern Christian city, Christians killing Christians. This is not very good. It's certainly not the words of Jesus. On their way to Jerusalem, and as you know the story of the crusade, it was bloody, people were killed, and it's such a regrettable part of our faith. What was their motto? Deus vult, 2 Latin words. God wills it. God wants us to take over Jerusalem. And no subtleties of arguments prevailed. It was all any means to the end of opening up Jerusalem to the pilgrims, killing, slaughtering thousands of people with no regard for the sanctity of life, either fellow Christians or the Jews. There were Jews in the area, many of them were killed, or the Muslims that they found there occupying the Holy Land. Can we all agree that the Crusades was a pretty bad episode? It went on for 200 years. Even a great saint, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian monk, one of the great scholars, he was a doctor of the church, great teacher of the church. Even he went around France preaching in churches like this one, go to the Holy Land, Christian knights, that's the phrase he kept using. And the Pope, by the way, had been a student of his, Pope Eugene II, and he persuaded his old teacher, Bernard of Clairvaux, a holy man, except for that one mistake, urging people to pick up their arms, swords, whatever they had back then, crossbows, and go to the Holy Land and slay the infidel. Okay, so Crusades, Holy War. Do we still have, I don't know what to call them, people with extreme hatred in their hearts today? Yes. Almost all religious communities, think of the Islamic jihadists. Very small number, probably less than 1% of Islamic people have ever thought of picking up an arm and slaying the infidel, whether that's Christians or Jews, but there are some, right? We've had terrorism. It's 25 years since the 9/11 episode. Are there still Christians, like Christian nationalists, who want to take up arms and slay people for the gospel? There are. Are there Jewish nationalists? There certainly are. What are they called? The settlers in the West Bank, who have actually killed some of the local Palestinians. Are there Hindu nationalists? Yes. You go to India, the party of Modi. Now, he's not a violent man himself, but some of his followers. Even the Buddhists. I love Buddhism, right? It's like a peaceful religion. No, there are Buddhist nationalists in Myanmar, it's one of the few Buddhist-controlled countries, that have been killing people, like the Rohingya people. They're a Muslim minority. So all I'm saying is many religions have been twisted, distorted to lead to nonstop violence. They perceive an enemy, and there's no limits to their hatred and their violence. Okay, so it's called the Crusades in the Christian tradition. It's called Holy War or unlimited war in other traditions, okay, without any boundaries. So what is the answer? How do we limit the force of violence? We use the best organ that God gave us in our body, the gray matter of our brain. And we have come up with, I'll give you a little sketch of how this happened. Over the last 1,500 years or so, Christian theologians, philosophers, even some secular thinkers, international law thinkers like Pufendorf, and there's a whole bunch of other, Hugo Grotius, they came up with a theory called the just war theory. So a little background, historical background before we get to your handout. It really started before Christianity. You had people like Plato and Cicero, so these are not Christians, right? These were Roman and Greek philosophers, no connection to Christianity, before Christ anyway. And they started thinking about their empires, the Greek Athens Empire and the Roman Empire. How are we using force, our Roman army, let's say? And they started saying, you know, I've detected some excesses. There are times when we massacred people, like on the borders of the Roman Empire, when it was unnecessary. So they started thinking of some conditions under which force is justified, and then some conditions to limit the use of force. And that really is the point of the just war theory. Started before Christianity, and then there are a great hero, well, two of them back to back, St. Ambrose in the late 300s and St. Augustine, his student, in the early 400s, wrote things about, wrote treatises about limiting violence, okay? So they began to come up with a list, and your handout page from my book, Living Justice, is all about, in fact, it may be too long a list, but we'll go through it quickly. Lists of criteria, of conditions under which the use of armed force, deadly force, weapons, back then swords and whatever, sabers, today, I don't know, all kinds of conventional weapons, guns and bazookas and cruise missiles, under which those could imaginably be employed. Over the years, so St. Augustine left us the longest legacy in his book, The City of God. It's a really long book. None of my students has gotten all the way to the end. I urge them, I beg them. It's finals week coming up, so I'm thinking about my students this week. Okay, so St. Augustine left this legacy, and by the way, we have a pope named Leo XIV, who's a member of what order? The Augustinians. Fascinating. We just had the first Jesuit pope, and now we have the second Augustinian pope. It's unbelievable. He believes in the legacy of St. Augustine. Leo from Chicago, right? South side of Chicago. He has been speaking out about that legacy of using the just war theory towards limiting the war. Of course, the one that's on our minds is the current operation against Iran on the part of the US and Israel. We'll get to that, okay? So just war theory, what else do I want to say about it? It was further developed in the Middle Ages. A couple of Jesuits contributed. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, now a saint, contributed to the just war theory. It was codified a little further by another Jesuit, Francisco Suarez. There are many others, Vittoria, all these great thinkers. And it became part of international law, totally aside from Christianity. People with no connection to the church, they started using the conditions, the criteria, your page, the items on your page, as the, I would say, the litmus test, the dividing line between whether a given military operation is justified or is it excessive and should be a wise leader, a prudent leader, king, an emperor, now these days a president, prime minister, should say, no, don't unleash your army in this way, in this purpose. Okay, so so it's in international law. The United Nations recognizes the conditions of just war theory, and I'll just tell you, in church documents, if you're looking for to read more about it, okay, I can recommend 2 or 3 things. So, do you all know about the Catechism of the Catholic Church? I didn't bring my copy because I didn't fit in my knapsack. It's really big. It's a 1,200-page book. But in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which was promulgated in 1992 by Pope John Paul II, has hardly been changed. Just a few lines have been changed since 1992. There is part 3, which is about life in Christ. It's the moral part. By the way, my business card says I'm professor of moral theology. So I have to talk about the Catechism part 3. And one of the chapters in part 3 is the 10 Commandments. There's 10 sections, right? And guess what commandment the just war theory falls under? The 5th commandment, you shall not kill. Okay, so look it up. I'll even give you the reference numbers. Paragraph 2302 to 2317. Okay, the Catechism has thousands of paragraphs. So in those, 15 paragraphs, we have a laying out of the just war theory. It's about 3 pages. I Xeroxed them. I have them here if you want to see them. And it's going to cover what we're just about to talk about. An even better place, because it's a little longer treatment, in 1983, the United States Catholic bishops, something like 240 of them, voted on a document. Now, it's not yesterday. 1983 is a long time ago. But the document is called The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. It's about 80 pages long. And towards the end of it, they pulled together the conditions of the just war theory. As a matter of fact, the page that you have, I've relied primarily on the U.S. Catholic bishops' description of the conditions of the just war theory based in 1983. Oh, and I'm so proud of the bishops because they also have a whole half chapter on pacifism. And they say, yeah, it may not be realistic for any of us or many of us to be pacifist, but it is a witness value. It's a reminder of the peaceful nature of Jesus Christ, who has earned the moniker, we use it all the time, the Prince of Peace. So to be a Catholic, you can choose the path of pacifism, or you can choose the path of the just war theory. They don't like the holy war or crusade, by the way. They're really smart. It should not be endorsed, okay? So we've talked about all the background. Is there anything left? I think I've covered all of these notes. This is fantastic. It's time to take a look at your page. So you'll notice, by the way, it comes from my book called Living Justice, okay? I made this chart for my students, really, and then I put it in my book. Earlier, back in 2003, I had a shorter version of the book, in my book, Catholic Perspectives on Peace and War. And why did it come out in 2003? I wanted to write a book to do exactly what we're doing today, to help Catholics sort out the categories. This was written the same month as the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I remember March, Colin Powell tried to persuade us that we should go into war. He spoke before the UN. President Bush authorized the troops. Vice President Cheney supplied coverage. And it turned out that war was not necessary because there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So many people have apologized for a misuse of the just war theory. So I wrote that up in my book, Catholic Perspectives on Peace and War. Okay, so let's get to those conditions, okay? So I hope that the chart is clear. You'll notice that it's divided into 3 sets of categories or criteria, okay? When is a war just, okay? Now I'm going to use some Latin. You'll notice on the leftmost side of the page, the 3 Latin categories, I'll translate it. I did on the page, actually. Jus ad bellum, which means justice upon entering a war. If a war is about to start, if you're a statesman, you're a head of the army, you're a prime minister of a European country, or the president, or the secretary of defense, and you are facing the dilemma, do we unleash the US Army or the English Army or whatever upon this world situation? Do we send troops abroad? Those criteria, you see 7 of them, we'll get to them in a second. Those are the criteria. Then there's a second category, is jus in bello. Once the war has started, what constitutes justice in the conduct of the war? We'll get to that briefly. And then it's only in the last 50 years that the bottom third of the chart has been developed. It's actually fairly new. St. Augustine didn't think about it. St. Ambrose didn't think about jus post bellum, justice after a war, okay? So these are the conditions. So let's look at the top of the page, back up to the top. So the justice in entering a war, the jus ad bellum, the goal of these 7 criteria is to set a limit on when you go to war. You don't want to just send the army out for any small reason. It has to be a weighty reason. It has to be appropriate, okay? So what do we think about it? What are these criteria? You see 7 there. Other people might have 6 or 8, but these are the 7 that the bishops used, okay? These traditional criteria. Number 1, a just cause. There has to be a reason to send your troops. And by the way, these days, troops don't just include ground forces. It's Navy, it's submarines, it's aircraft, it's attack helicopters. So there has to be an adequate reason, a real and certain danger. And by the way, it has to be a defensive war. You can't just justify a war, say, well, we're the United States. We would like to take over some territory in North America or Europe. Let's just push back the Canadian border because we could use some of that land in Ontario. That doesn't cut it. That is not a justifiable reason for a war, whether a Christian reason or even a secular international law reason, okay? So it can't just be greed. It has to be defensive. Okay, competent authority. That's the second criteria. You know the word vigilantism? When somebody takes the law in their own hands, they pick up a weapon and say, I feel aggrieved. I'm just going to shoot up this place, or I'm going to get revenge. Somebody stole my girlfriend. This has actually happened quite a bit in human history. So competent authority means it's the government a rightly constituted, legal, juridical authority. It has to be a legitimate and publicly proclaimed law. And by the way, in our country, we have a constitution. Article 1 is about the powers of Congress, and Section 8 of Article 1 says that among the powers of Congress is the right to declare war. So it was never the intention of the Founding Fathers for the executive, the president, to declare unilaterally a war. Over the centuries, the custom was for the president to submit to Congress what's called a bill of the authorization of the use of force. Congress would vote on it. I know that in the past 100 years, since World War II anyway, it's been less likely less often that Congress initiates the bill of war. Usually presidents act on executive authority. They claim it's an emergency, and sometimes, less often in recent decades, they submit to Congress a request for the authorization for the use of force. In 1973, after the Vietnam War, Congress passed the War Powers Act, reasserting congressional authority, but by and large, presidents have ignored it, including in the current episode. Maybe you've followed this more closely than I. The third item is comparative justice. So, if you are aggrieved, if you were attacked, then you can respond in defense. Here's another instance. The U.S. has often come to the aid of desperate victims of unjust aggressors. Okay, so think of Ukraine. Just this time of year, it was the spring of 2022. That's 4 years. I can't believe it's 4 years ago. Russia invaded Ukraine. They hold about 20% of Ukrainian territory, and the U.S. decided to help the Ukraine. We have not sent troops. I don't predict that we ever will, but we have supplied Ukraine with a lot of armaments and aid of all sorts, okay? And it's clear that this was the right thing to do, at least to me, and the Catholic Church has supported this too, Catholic leaders like the bishops, cardinals, because an unjust aggressor, Russia, Putin's Russia, has invaded an innocent country, and even Pope Francis he doesn't like to take sides. No pope is eager to take sides in a conflict, and you know why? Because popes, they want to be mediators between the sides. Pope Francis, to his dying day, last April, it was Easter, April 21st, when he died, a year ago now, he wanted to be in the position to mediate between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The opening never actually happened. There were some talks in Istanbul, Turkey, but he did not get his life wish to be a peacemaker. So popes are reticent, they're reluctant to denounce either side. But in that case, the comparative justice was so obvious, and the U.S., I'm sure, can feel justified in helping Ukraine. So right intention. Your goal is to, if you're going to intervene send the army in, your goal must be to establish peace as soon as possible. Don't let the war go on any longer than it has to. Don't, for example, insist on unilateral surrender, or what do they call it, total surrender, unconditional surrender. End the conflict as soon as you can, as long as you have protected the innocent parties and you have reestablished at least some kind of justice. It can't be for revenge. It has to be for a pure intention, the right intention. The fifth one is really, in a sense, my favorite one, or maybe it's the one that's triggered the most often. War must be the last resort. You must have tried all diplomatic measures, all kinds of, and of course, to partake in diplomacy, you have to be very patient. Remember the negotiations to end the Vietnam War went on for several years, the early 70s, before they signed a peace accord? When Iran, this is now more current, it was about 10 years ago, when there was a treaty with Iran to send in inspectors to prevent them from developing, is it called enriched uranium, able to be used for atomic bombs and missiles, weapons. It took 2 or 3 years, I think it was the Obama administration, it took years to set up that treaty. So you have to ask the question, is this war, the current one in Iran, or any other war, the result of a last resort calculation? Have we exhausted all peaceful alternatives, even economic sanctions? The sixth item is the probability of success. This simply is a reminder that if you're a small power, throwing your might against a giant behemoth, a big power, superpower, if it's going to be futile, that's not a good use of your army or your civilian population, et cetera. And then proportionality. A good statesman, a statesperson, someone who's deciding this, has to think about the costs that will be incurred in this war. Okay? Does it measure up to the gains? Okay? Do the ends justify the means? Oh, I'm way longer than I want. So we can go a little quicker over the last two, and then I'll take your questions. The second set of criteria kick in once the war has started. So you've decided that all 7 criteria meet the qualification. We've kind of checked that all of those items off our list. Yes, it's a defensive war. It's a last resort. It could succeed. It's proportional, waged by competent authority. Often that includes the United Nations these days, allies, alliances like NATO. We've checked all of those 7 boxes in the jus ad bellum, and now it's time for conducting the war in an upright, moral, ethical way, in line with Christian values, we in church would say. Well, what are the conditions in the conduct of war? You see that the goal here is to set limits for war by ruling out the use of inappropriate means towards the end of reestablishing peace, once a conflict has started. The 2 traditional ones are proportionality and discrimination. Proportionality means that your response to an aggressor must not exceed the initial harm. So if some country takes over, I don't know, like a mile, say Canada invaded the little tip of Maine. I've never been up that north, but I hear it's very nice. And they took over 100 yards in Maine. Are we going to send nuclear arms into Montreal and blow up Toronto? No, it's got to be a proportional response. That's a silly example. But we have seen countries overreact and destroy much more than was at stake at the beginning. Weapons of mass destruction, obviously, has changed the equation, so we have to consider the modern means of warfare. And don't forget, the just war theory was developed in the Middle Ages, by and large, when the biggest weapon you had was, I think, called a crossbow or something like that. They didn't have armaments, they didn't have explosives, they didn't even have guns. Now we have weapons of mass destruction, nuclear arms. You drop a nuclear weapon, an atomic bomb, you can't just say, oh, look, we killed their general and their corporal. No, you've killed hundreds of thousands of people. Think of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, where hundreds of thousands of innocent civilian Japanese died. So the weapons of mass destruction has raised the stakes of proportionality. And then the related jus in bello criteria, discrimination. No direct attack upon civilians is allowed. If someone is a non-combatant, they must be protected. In the first day of the Iran bombing strikes, I think it was February 28th, one of the first bombs landed on a school for girls, and over 200 people died, most of them schoolgirls. Okay? You can say it was a mistake, and I'm sure it was. Nobody probably deliberately targeted that. But every time you resort to deadly force with huge weapons, these bomb buster weapons, cruise missiles, you are subjecting yourself to the likelihood that you will be killing civilians. In fact, modern warfare is not surgical. You hear that word. Oh, it was a surgical strike. We just took out the anti-aircraft batteries. Yeah, but people lived right next door to that. It doesn't mean you can never strike an enemy, but it means you better have all of the other criteria checked off and take every possible precaution against killing any civilians who are caught in the crossfire. This happens in fighting terrorist groups as well. So anyway, that's the discrimination. So we've now done almost the entire page. What remains are the criteria that were just developed since the 70s or 80s called jus post bellum, justice after a war. And again, people in the Middle Ages didn't think about this, but if you are going to use your army, you say you have the proposed military action has passed all of those criteria, 7 at the top of the page, the 2 jus in bello in the middle of the page. it still might not be a just war. You can't justify a war, a given use of force, unless you're seeking to limit the war in this way. You have to have a good withdrawal strategy. You have to set up the future for a peaceful resolution. So I'll just read the 6 at the bottom really quickly. Prudent withdrawal, it's like we call this an exit strategy. Immediate security so that nobody is subjected to harm. Long-term security, so you have to have a plan for providing security for the people on the front lines. You have to have a just accord, so a peace treaty has to be equitable. Physical reconstruction, the U.S. has done a lot of physical reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan after those, 20-plus year wars. And social restoration, trying to ease the wounds of war and encourage reconciliation. Okay, so you are now up to date. You're up there with my students. You can get 3 credits. My final exam is next week. You can apply. I'll get you in there, the Fordham Registrar. So that's a lot of talking. It went longer than I expected. Sorry about that. But now you, and more importantly, your conscience, remember the C word? You are up to date. You've seen the criteria for a just war, okay? The question before you, and we're not going to settle anything right now, but when you go home tonight and you're thinking about it, say a little prayer about just war theory. Have the wars that you are familiar with in your lifetime, perhaps, have they measured up to these criteria? I would especially recommend the last resort criteria. The U.S. has been in a number of armed conflicts, some of them large-scale, long-standing wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, and some, things like the incursion in Venezuela. They captured Maduro back in January. That was more of an incursion than a war. Can we justify the things that we as a country have done? I predict that this congregation would not reach consensus on that, and that's okay. But in your conscience, can you support a war based on your knowledge of these criteria? Okay, and that's really all I wanted to present. Much more could be said about the recent dust-up between our Pope and our president. So I read the daily news only for the sports scores, by the way. And this was a page from about 2 weeks ago. There's been a war of words. There's been, a verbal sparring between Pope Leo and President Trump. So the cover of the Daily News, Holy War. I'll read the subtitle with the picture of the president and the Pope. Facing backlash for images evoking Jesus. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Trump lashes out at Pope Leo, who maintains that he is looking to promote peace as the Iran war persists. So the media has had a feeding frenzy. The media loves controversy. So just be aware that that's what happens when people differ on the application of just war principles. Okay, so now it's time to do the questions. Again, I'm sorry I went so long.
But before we take any questions, let's just give Father Tom thanks for his unbelievably thorough and clear and just illuminating talk on an incredibly important topic that I think we are all very interested in and can think and pray about. So thank you, Father. If anybody else has questions on their index cards, please, Alfie is collecting, and there are lots of very lengthy questions.
Cut to the chase.
So I'll just read them out loud, and if they speak to you, great. If not, we'll go on to the next one. So, how often has the just war doctrine been cited in the last 100 years by the Catholic Church in support of a conflict?
Oh, in support. Oh, that was the zinger comes at the end. So no pope that I know of, and I'm kind of an expert on the papacy. I've been giving interviews on all kinds of media. Friday morning, coming up, is it May 8th? I will appear at 7:45 on the WCBS TV news. So did anybody watch news at 7:45 in the morning? I will be interviewed live. I'll be in my campus by Zoom on the papacy. So about Pope Leo's first year. It's exactly 1 year. So I do know a lot about popes. I do not recall any time that a pope has said, go for it. Fight this war. Now, here's a little thumbnail sketch. World War I, the Pope was Pope Benedict XV. He was a peace lover. He was situated in Rome. World War I was going on all around him, Europe. It was the Axis powers, the Germans. And he was trying to mediate the peace. So he never said, I'm on this side or that side. He simply tried to mediate the peace. And by the way, they say he died of a broken heart. His entire papacy was 1914, the year the World War I started, to 1922. In World War II, Pius XI was on the throne of Peter right till 1939. Then it was Pius XII. So those two Piuses were hemmed in by Italy. Remember, Mussolini's Italy surrounds the Vatican on the side of Hitler. Those two popes didn't dare come out for either side. Okay, they were just silent. And you can accuse Pius XII especially. Somebody once wrote a book called Hitler's Pope because he didn't denounce Hitler or Mussolini. He wasn't free to. He would have been killed. I mean, they would have just invaded the Vatican. In more recent wars, popes always faulted the warring parties for failing to negotiate and have diplomacy. So think of some of them. Korean War, Vietnam War, First Gulf War in 1991, Second Gulf War 2003, Iraq, Afghanistan, there's been so many other wars. They have always, urged negotiations and never sided with either side. So in a sense, no pope has blessed or sanctioned a war. And I just want to say one more little tagline here. Some people don't like this fact. Some people think that the popes should come out on one side or the other. It's not going to happen, by the way, okay? And here's why. They want to be mediators. They want to stand up for the side of peace exclusively. So I heard the complaint against John Paul II. It's when I was a graduate student back in the 1990s, before I even wrote my first book there. The Pope is a practical pacifist, John Paul II. He's a practical pacifist. And for them, that was a bad thing. For me, it's a good thing. I want my popes to be on the side of peace, even if it looked out. In World War II, it was so clear. I wasn't alive. Were some of you alive? It was so clear that somebody needed to stand up to Hitler and Mussolini and Japan. But even then, the popes wanted to just talk about diplomacy. So that's the short answer. It's a long answer. Sorry, that's the long answer.
Another question, how involved should the church actually get with all things political?
Yeah, that's the hardest question ever. If you are a faithful Christian, and by the way, the differences between the Roman Catholic interpretation of the just war theory and the Protestant, mainline Protestant, Baptist, Methodists, Episcopalians, Lutherans, they're almost identical. If you take seriously the call of Jesus to be peacemakers, it's one of the Beatitudes, and you want to follow the example of Jesus, who didn't lift a finger, even when he was being captured and crucified, then I think that you have to, the first answer when you hear about a war breaking out is, hopefully, is, oh my goodness, I hope that people stop the race to war, okay? If you go through these steps then, take this home, if you go through all those steps and in your conscience you can justify the war, then let me recommend this attitude to you. I talk with my students a lot about attitude. The proper attitude of a person who's implementing a just war theory and concludes in his or her conscience that it is time to take up arms, it's justified. The proper attitude is not militaristic, vainglory, glorifying war. Let's get them. Let's crush our enemies. Be vindictive. The proper attitude is restraint. Martin Luther said, anybody who picks up arms, even in a just cause, with a just war theory, should have tears in their eyes as they are using their weapons, and we would say squeezing the trigger. It's like, oh, I feel so bad. I'm so reluctant to use force. I only do it as a last resort reluctantly. So the attitude must not be vainglory, militaristic, or vengeful.
Another interesting question talks about really who decides that they are fulfilling the criteria of the just war.
Excellent question. That's a question that scholars keep coming back to. I talk about it in one of my books. So who developed the just war theory? Mostly theologians and philosophers, and in the last few centuries, experts in international law, legal jurists, they call them, okay? So and the United Nations now is kind of like the clearinghouse for just war theory development. Who is just war theory addressed to? That's a fascinating question. I'm not sure that there's a single answer, but here's what I think of. When St. Augustine was writing The City of God, he was the first one to codify things. And then when Cardinal Bellarmine and all those medieval people, Grotius, they were hoping that the emperors and kings of their time, the Middle Ages, would be listening to them, overhearing, reading their treatises. They probably didn't think much about the people in the pews. They were probably addressing their ideas, their writings, to the people at the top of the pyramid who made decisions of whether to go to war. In those days, emperors and kings. In our days, presidents, prime ministers, secretaries of defense, I guess. Who else declares war? And, NATO. Okay, so NATO has rarely used arms, but NATO used a lot of arms in the Balkans in the 1990s. That was a time, remember, it was the Serbians invading Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Kosovars. NATO dropped a lot of bombs to keep the two sides apart. And the just war theory was being used, not so much by the Pope, but by some theologians, bishops, and appealing to those people, the NATO leaders and the presidents of those countries. Yeah.
During a visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki this past August, on the 80th day of remembrance of the dropping of the atomic bombs, Cardinals Robert McElroy and Blaise Kupich called for a more holistic approach, an integral one, in which priority should be given to nonviolence, with just war theory taking a more secondary role. What are your thoughts on this approach to world peace? Is it achievable?
I greatly admire those two bishops that you mentioned, and recently they were joined by Cardinal Joseph Tobin of Newark, not far from here. I've met all three of those men at different times. I'm always kind of starstruck when I meet a cardinal. But they appeared on 60 Minutes about 2 weeks ago. I think I'm the last person in the world that watches 60 Minutes, but I enjoy it a great deal when it's not conflicting with the Knicks playoff game. So those three cardinals, two of them on the occasion of the 80th anniversary, it was the August, right, of last summer, and of 45 to 2025, and now on this, during the Iran war, joined by Cardinal Tobin. I think they're on the right path. I want my church leaders to say what they have said on both those occasions, to not to baptize a war, because if a war is going to happen, it's going to be because political leaders in their conscience can justify a war. It's not because a cardinal is going to say something, but I want them to be the reminders of values. Okay, they're not going to settle. It's going to be a president, it's going to be NATO, it's going to be whoever. I want them to continue to voice the reminder of the value of peace. That's what Leo has done. The strongest sentence of Leo was just as he was getting on the plane to go to his Africa trip. Remember, he went to 11 days, Algeria. He went to, am I going to get all four? Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. Oh, good. I'm getting ready for my interview. He went to those four places, but as he was approaching his trip, he was asked, does he approve of the war in Iran? And he said, he quoted Isaiah prophet Isaiah, Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 1, verse 15, that those who imagine that God is on their side in the war, if their hands are full of blood, then their prayers do not reach God. He's quoting the scripture, which is what popes are supposed to do. So, no, and I don't expect church leaders, I wouldn't, what's the word, approve of church leaders citing and say, oh yeah, go ahead, shoot them up, because they know that some civilians will die. And the vicar of Christ on earth, Pope Leo, is not, it just wouldn't be appropriate for him to say, go for it, kill those people. He should be the voice of peace.
If you have a few more moments, I'm not sure, I think we might have some more questions coming up. I'm seeing the stack just growing over there. But,
They're all good questions, thank you, everybody.
How do the principles discussed today apply to the use of human shields?
Okay, so that is one of the most intricate, what's the word I'm looking for, like a spider's web, a snare of questions. So I mentioned terrorism only briefly. And by the way, a lot of the military, the deployment of militaries around the world in the last 25 years, certainly since 9/11, has been anti-terrorist, right? Remember ISIS, that very strong, again, it's like the crusade version within Islam, the Islamicist, the Islamic State. A lot of the US effort has gone to limiting ISIS, and we've done a pretty good job in Syria and in, I'm going to say, Iraq, and I think in parts of Turkey. ISIS had a foothold on territory there. They called it the Islamic Republic, yeah. So anti-terrorist use of force is something that, many people can justify. Again, it's not country against country. It's really all of humanity trying to limit the imminent attacks from terrorists of any sort. So again, many people can use the criteria of the just war to justify military efforts to stop ISIS and other terrorists. The mention of human shields is just such an intractable issue. The Hamas in Gaza, right? So they attacked October 23rd, 2023. They spilled over Gaza. They captured hostages. They killed hundreds and probably thousands of Israelis in the kibbutzes at a Nova music festival. Horrible, horrible. And when Israel struck back at Hamas, moving into Gaza City, they discovered that Hamas was intertwined. They put their weapons stashes, their caches of weapons in hospitals, in schools, surrounded by civilians. Oh, what a difficult situation. First of all, it's cynical on the part of Hamas, and I believe Hezbollah, another terrorist group in southern Lebanon, does the same thing. It's just horrific. I would not, if I were the president, or if I was, I don't know, what's his name, Netanyahu, I would not send troops or bomb a hospital if I knew that half the people in that hospital were sick children and the other half were terrorists. Would you? I'll leave that out. I think that there are times when the terrorists intermingling, using human shields, calls for us to, even though that's a cynical thing to do, and it's hateful, we hate it, we denounce it, we should not be dropping bombs when 50% of the people in that neighborhood or in the facility are civilians. So I'm not saying it's an easy choice. I would make the choice to restrain. And that's really hard to hear, but I think it is.
What does just war theory say about allying with countries who do not follow the rules of just war?
Yeah, and that is the case. My short answer is it's very hard. That is, Hitler in World War II was not playing nice. He was ruthless. He was brutal. And by the way, who was the United States' most sizable ally in World War II? It wasn't Britain. They were a small country at that point. It was Russia. Stalin was our ally. Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt met several times during the war to map out strategy. We knew that Stalin was bloodthirsty. He had killed purges and massacres. He had killed tens of millions of people. And yet, fighting Hitler was such a priority that FDR found a way to justify it. So Hitler was an extreme example of someone who didn't play nice. Now we have other horrible opponents in the world. Saddam Hussein was a horrible opponent. The Iranian regime is a no-holds-barred opponent. They launch terrorist strikes, support terrorist groups. I believe that we should still seize the moral high ground. Not everybody agrees with this position, but I'll say it. I'm just shadowing what Pope Leo has said. To seize the moral high ground is to show more compunction, more conscience, more restraint than your enemy does. And so I just gave you one example. Don't bomb a hospital if half the people there are innocent civilians, even though you'd probably wipe out the terrorist leaders. So in the case of modern warfare, show more restraint. Seize the moral high ground. Have a higher standard of conduct, like the ones on your page, than even the cynical enemies would show. If we go down to their level, if we become just like Hitler or just like Saddam Hussein or just like whoever the other opponents are, the terrorist groups, then we're no better than them.
Do you think the time has come for the Catholic hierarchy to come to the table with greater urgency to impose moral conscience on governments that decide to embark on unjust wars?
Yeah, so there's a question of style, okay? And, I'm a theologian, I'm a trained theologian. I don't feel competent to raise my voice with like an edge to it. I don't want to accuse the cardinals of being maybe too peace-loving. I don't think you can be too peace-loving. And I don't want to accuse the other side, the more bellicose side, whether there are some religious voices that are on the bellicose side. I would be happy. My vocation as a theologian is to clarify things, not to be a rooter for one side or the other. You could probably tell from the way I described the very strict conditions of the just war theory that I'm joining all those recent popes as a practical pacifist. I think of very few wars that have been, maybe World War II was the most recent one, where we actually exhausted all the conditions. Ooh, I just thought of one religious voice that I would lay blame upon. And I don't want to make any enemies in the Russian Orthodox Church, but I do have to say, in all honesty, if you've been following the war in Ukraine, Putin, the Russian president, executed that war. He started it. And in the opening weeks of the war, February to March of 2022, the Russian Orthodox Church, so a slight majority of all people in the, what do they call the Russian Federation, belong to that church. Kirill, his name is Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. He decided, with his committee of advisors, he decided to help, support, justify Putin's invasion. Pope Francis didn't like this at all. Pope Francis had been planning to meet with Kirill. They actually met for about 10 minutes at an airport in Havana when Pope Francis was coming to the United States in September of 2015, but that was the very brief. It was a neutral ground, Cuba, right? And Kirill was there on other business. I believe that Pope Francis wanted to meet with Kirill again, maybe even accept an invitation to visit Russia, but he refused to after that point. He didn't pursue a possible meeting or even, deliberations. They had one Zoom call, I understand, shortly after that. Pope Francis dismissed Kirill. And I once heard a Roman Catholic cardinal, not Pope Francis because he was too nice, but a cardinal referred to Kirill as a choir boy for Putin. A church official, highly regarded, head of a church, patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, excusing the invasion of Ukraine by Putin's Russia. So there is one example. For the most part, I'll be humble. As a theologian, I don't pretend to have the inside scoop. I don't want to pass judgment on people. If in their conscience they can justify some use of force, I would let it stand, except in the egregious case of Archbishop, of Kirill, of Patriarch Kirill.
And this will be the final question, I think a more fun, lighthearted one for you, and that is, what is the most interesting thing your students have said in discussions about either this theory or current wars?
Yeah, yeah, good. I like the lighthearted part. This has been pretty heavy, right? I mean, anytime you talk about people's lives, not one or two, tens of thousands of people's lives are at stake. And even the United States, with our overwhelming force in the past 2 months, we've lost a dozen or more service people and all kinds of issues. So so when I teach my course, it's for seniors only. You have to be pretty advanced to take my course. It's called Theologies of Peace. What are the 3 theologies of peace? Oh, you know them now. You're so smart. Pacifism, holy war, just war, and the third is, holy war or crusades, and the third one is, of course, the just war. I throw out the question to them. So, some semesters I make it the midterm exam they have to write. Which side do you fall on, pacifism or just war? I always expected 90% to be just war thinkers, because really, it has been the mainstream of the Roman Catholic Church and most Protestant churches and the Eastern Orthodox churches. 50%, 60%. One year, 75% of my students, when we took a vote, said that war is never justified. Therefore, they said, I am a pacifist. I thought it would break down, like more women would be pacifists than men. Nope, it's equal. Men and women, this upcoming generation, maybe, I don't know much about popular culture. Maybe they listen to singers that are very peaceful people. When I think of rap, I don't like rap music. I don't think it's very peaceful. I talk about guns all the time. But anyway, maybe my students are reacting against that. That's probably what it is. They're reacting against the gun culture. And don't forget, Fordham is in the Bronx. We have 40% of the shootings in New York City, the 5 boroughs, this year so far, 4 months, have been in the Bronx, and a lot of them in the vicinity of Fordham. Okay? We also have a lot of fires for some reason. So anyway, maybe the young people today are getting the message of peace. I also staged this question to them. If there was another draft, say another type of Vietnam War, or the volunteer army that we have wasn't getting enough recruits, and there was a draft, conscription. And by the way, it would be men and women as well. They've changed the rules. Women would be as eligible as men if there were a selective service conscription. Everybody has to register, right? Would you serve the draft or agree to go in your army, do basic training, or would you go to the court and file a petition of conscientious objection? A lot of them would. Somewhere, I don't know, maybe half. I don't have a scientific, I haven't been counting. So all I could say is the next generation, 20-somethings, much more pacifist than I expected, probably more than my generation, whatever generation you're in. So I'm a baby boomer. Then we had Generation X. Then we had millennials, Generation Z. I don't even know these things anymore. But whatever the 20-year-olds are today, they are much more pacifist-leaning, conscientious objection than our generation, older people. So think about that. Maybe they're getting the message. I applaud it. So maybe they're getting the message that our popes have been talking about for a long time. But please don't go away thinking that there's never a time when a war is justified. Popes have been reluctant and by and large have not justified any wars. At most they've been silent, like during World War II. Maybe they shouldn't have been silent, but popes, you can count on our leadership, whether it's Cardinals Tobin and Supich and McElroy, whether it's Pope Leo or any pope really, to be a practical pacifist and to be extremely reluctant to justify a war. Again, it doesn't mean that a president in his or her, I would say her, his or her conscience could, in a clear conscience, knowing all of the state secrets that they know, none of us know, the intelligence, could justify war. But remember, when we thought we had intelligence in 2003 about the weapons of mass destruction with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and Colin Powell testified to the UN, we were wrong. Our intelligence was wrong. So I have a lot of doubts about our intelligence community these days. But I'm giving wide leeway to those leaders to make a good judgment. And I will fault them if it, that's why I wrote this book about the 2003 thing. I fault them in retrospect because we eventually learned there was no weapons of mass destruction there. So throw it to your conscience and assume a good conscience in our leaders. But if you think that they're not in good faith, if you think our leaders are ignoring crucial facts or they're just cutting corners, they just want to have a big army, they just want to be imperialistic, then you should raise your voice.
Well, thank you so much for your time with us today. Really appreciate it. For sure. Take two. Yeah.
The whole series.
I want to say hi.